Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to journalist Guillaume Ptak from the front lines of the battlefield in Ukraine, and we ask him how the U.S. presidential race is playing in the region. And then we dive into new details about Iran's nuclear program, China's efforts to undercut a U.S. maritime security alliance in the Red Sea, and yet another major warning sign about the terror threat to the American homeland. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Our colleague, Guillaume Ptak, is going to come to us later from the front lines of the war in Ukraine, so we're excited to hear his thoughts live from the ground there. But before we get to that, Guy, as always, first things first, what is on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another week on the podcast. Off the top, I was pretty interested with the very candid remarks that CIA Director William Burns gave on October 7 at the CIFR Briefs annual threat conference in Sea Island, Georgia. With heightening concern over a direct Israel-Iran war, Burns said that there is very real danger of a widening Middle East war, but he also said that U.S. intelligence has assessed that neither Israeli nor Iranian leaders seek a, quote, all-out conflict, end quote. We can, of course, debate what the definition of an all-out conflict would be, but the fact that the CIA director spoke publicly on this is certainly interesting, particularly because of his own personal and diplomatic expertise regarding Iran. Remember, William Burns was one of the architects and negotiators of the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. The deal aimed to contain Iran's uranium enrichment activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Of course, former President Trump ultimately pulled the U.S. out of that deal in 2018. What's interesting is that Burns said on October 1 that the CIA has not seen any recent indication that Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is pushing to accelerate toward producing nuclear bombs. But at the same time, in classic spy chief fashion, Burns hinted at intel indicating that Iran is more technically poised right now than perhaps ever before to quickly develop a nuclear weapon if it wants to. He actually said the breakout time for such a weapon is about a week or a little more. Burns gave these remarks while Israel's war cabinet was scrambling behind closed doors in recent days in a heated debate over how and when Israel may retaliate against Iran for the missile strikes that Tehran carried out against Israel roughly a week ago. An interesting piece of that was that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears to have deliberately canceled or postponed what had been a planned visit to Washington by his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Netanyahu apparently wanted to speak directly to President Biden before sending Gallant to Washington. The fact that Gallant's trip was blocked may indicate a growing fight within the Israeli war cabinet, or at least between Netanyahu and Gallant. Remember, Ben, about a month ago in late August, there were reports that Netanyahu and Gallant got into a shouting match during one meeting over the prospect of a hostage release ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, a deal that never materialized. So we're tracking all of this at Threat Status. Another quick thing on my radar, Ben, was our own story at Threat Status. The Chinese leaders went behind the Biden administration's back a few months ago by trying to cut some sort of deal with the Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen to get the Houthis not to carry out missile attacks on Chinese commercial shipping interests in the Red Sea. Interestingly, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell spoke openly at a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace event last week about how Beijing had tried to cut this deal with the Houthis and had turned down requests by the Biden administration that China instead participate in some way in the U.S.-led international naval armada that's been trying to protect commercial ships from Houthi missile attacks over the past year. Another of our national security correspondents, Bill Gertz, spoke with a diplomatic source who said Beijing had calculated that the Houthi shipping attacks would tarnish the U.S. global image and that China would only be helping the U.S. if it joined the naval armada. So it instead tried to cut this deal with the Houthis, which ultimately failed when a Houthi missile hit a Chinese-owned and operated oil tanker in the Red Sea in May. You can imagine that this got my mind churning, Ben, because we have discussed on the podcast before how some in the U.S. national security community claim that some of the attacks that the Houthis have carried out have actually used Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile technology. I digress on this for now, but again, this issue of China's role in the Middle East is something we're constantly tracking in threat status at the Washington Times.
Yeah, it's really complex. I mean, the amount of actors and differing, dynamics and relationships at play here is fascinating to say the least. And on a somewhat related note, I want to discuss terror plots here at home. Now, listeners might remember that last week I talked kind of at length about this new terror threat snapshot from the House Homeland Security Committee that painted a really disturbing picture of the jihadist threat to the United States. And it cited more than 50 cases in 29 states over the past few years of individuals here in America arrested for allegedly trying to provide material support to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, in one case Hezbollah, and other groups, along with other terror-related charges. Well, on the heels of that, this week we got another one because our colleague Stephen Dinan wrote about the arrest of Nasir Ahmed Tohedi, a 27-year-old Afghan who came to the U.S. in 2021 as part of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's now charged with planning to launch a suicide attack on Election Day next month. And he also apparently was, at best, sympathetic to ISIS, according to authorities. Specifically, the FBI said he planned to use 2 AK-47 rifles to shoot up what he described as large gatherings of people, and he told agents that he expected to be martyred in that attack. The FBI said he planned to carry out that attack with his nephew, a juvenile who's not named in the court documents, and also said that he expected he would earn 72 virgins and a crown of jewels in heaven afterwards. So this is exactly the kind of thing, Guy, that the House GOP report was warning about. An individual in the U.S., in this particular case, someone who came from one of the world's foremost terror hotbeds just 3 years ago, who sympathizes, apparently, allegedly, with terrorist groups and is willing to attack soft targets like election polling places. By the way, he was also planning to use guns to do it, allegedly, which is the exact kind of attack that we saw ISIS-K perpetrate in Russia earlier this year at a concert hall in Moscow. And that's the exact kind of attack that FBI Director Christopher Wray warned that terrorists or their sympathizers could try to launch here. Look, this is a big deal. And it's one that the next president is going to have to grapple with. We talk about this on the show a lot, and I think with good reason, Guy, because the threat is growing, whether we want to admit it or not. This isn't just fear-mongering. These groups are getting stronger abroad, and their reach is obviously extending deeper into the U.S. and into Europe. So whether it's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris who wins the election in November, they're going to have to deal with this and quickly, or else I'm afraid that we could see a significant tragedy, and let's hope that we don't.
Ben, it is definitely interesting. I do want to point out the court documents that the Justice Department circulated about the case. This was also an undercover FBI investigation that federal agents were involved in basically trying to sell the suspect the AK-47s that he, is accused of plotting to want to use in an election day attack. Those types of undercover operations are always eye-opening and have all kinds of implications. And it's just an important fact and detail that was in those court documents.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a silver lining. If you want to look at this, I guess, through the other side of the looking glass, if you will. These plots have all been foiled so far. You talk about 50 plus of these. We talk about Steve Merchant and the alleged Iranian-backed plot to assassinate Donald Trump, which was foiled. This plot, which was foiled. So law enforcement is good at stopping these. But, as they say, the enemies only need to be right once.
Guillaume Ptak is a seasoned war correspondent who's been living in Ukraine for the past 3 years, writing amazing, sobering frontline dispatches for a range of international media outlets. Fortunately, he's our own special threat status correspondent in Ukraine. You can find his articles on the Washington Times website. Guillaume, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
So it was a pleasure to be here, guys.
You have done a bunch of interesting stories lately, including from Kursk, but about a week ago, you were at the International Defense Tech Investment Summit that got held in Kiev. This is a summit that its mission is to demonstrate Ukraine's position as a global hub for defense innovations and a fertile ground for international investment. Tell us who was at the summit. What was its primary focus? What did you see there? And how did it all kind of come off in Kiev while the war is going on with Russia?
Of course. So first thing that should be noted is that there were two different, so there was the a defense forum, if you will, and then the defense tech summit. I was present at the latter, not at the first one. The first one was the big fish, if you will. Like you had the top government officials, including President Zelensky. You had, about 280 foreign and Ukrainian defense companies meeting all together. So I'll touch upon that a little later. The second one was mostly dedicated to innovation. It was showcasing what mostly Ukrainians, but not only companies had been producing. And it went from, sea drones to laser tag equipment and games repurposed into actual training equipment for the Ukraine army that shocks the soldier when he gets, hit by the laser. The Defense Forum, not the summit, was also especially fruitful. We had a number of announcements, namely a number of joint ventures between Ukrainian and foreign Western arms companies, American included. What comes to mind, for example, is that the production of the Switchblade kamikaze drones, about 600 units are going to be produced in Ukraine soon. KNDS, which is a big conglomerate, German and French, has announced that they will start basically repairing and maintaining the equipment that they have given or sold to Ukraine, and that includes Leopard 1 and 2 tanks, that includes the AMX 10 infantry combat vehicle.
What kind of security was there?
The security was pretty tight. Obviously, you had to show you had to show your documents. There was an embargo for media, for any sort of publication, and not even for the media. Basically, you couldn't take a single picture. Like, you could take the pictures, you could take the videos, you could take the interviews, you could do whatever you wanted, but you could not mention anywhere on any social media, anywhere, that you had been to that event while it was ongoing. And even then, we had about a 3 days delay, I reckon. I think it ended on Friday. And by Monday at midday, we were allowed to start speaking about it.
There must have been heightened concern that this thing would be penetrated by Russian spies, basically.
Of course. The latter one would have been of maybe less interest to the Russians, even though it was still very interesting. I'd say that the first one, the forum, obviously, while bringing together, top government officials, including President Zelensky himself, who the Russians have repeatedly tried to assassinate, would have made for a pretty amazing target for the Russians, but luckily it didn't happen.
Let's talk a little bit about drone technology. There's this narrative in the Western media that this entire conflict is in some way now being shaped by Ukrainian drone dominance or advancements and the efficiency of Ukraine's domestic drone production base. We've actually seen a wave in the last 3 weeks of a couple of really high-profile drone attacks inside Russia. Russian armories have been targeted. There was a strike in Russian-occupied Crimea against an oil refinery that was a drone attack. How do you assess the impact of drones? I mean, you're back and forth to the front line. You've seen this evolve over the last couple of years. Is it overstated, the effectiveness of these drones, and how big are the drones? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of them, but what are your thoughts on how how this impacts the conflict?
So I'll preface that by saying that like drones in a war are not necessarily a byproduct of this specific war, right? They were used in Nagorno-Karabakh when Azerbaijan invaded or liberated, depending on how you read the situation, and they made use of drones. But those were mostly attack drones flying very, very high. You know, the Bayraktar, those are big things. Now, the Ukrainians at the beginning of the war, what they didn't have in equipment and men, they made up for in just sheer like creativity, if you will. So the Ukrainians were the first to realize the potential for small, commercially available drones. We're talking Mavic, DJIs, the sort of stuff that you want to fly just to take pictures of your last, I don't know, ski trip. Those guys were using them to do initially reconnaissance and correcting artillery fire, right? And then they started making those contraptions that could, like, you could basically put any kind of explosive, kind of configure it a little bit, strap it to one of these, and then with a very simple release mechanism, have it dropped directly on enemy troop concentration, on tanks, but the problem is the Ukrainians have been the most innovative ones initially, and that was certainly one of the main advantage as they were, you know, basically repelling the Russians during the battle for Kiev. They made massive use of those drones, and they were indeed like the first to really maybe understand how potent of a weapon drone can be, or rather weapons, because there's so many uses to drones, coordinates, like, you know, targeting and that kind of stuff. That's just one part of it. Dropping grenades, that's another part of it, but there's plenty of uses. However, there's a saying, like I've heard it from a couple of Ukrainian soldiers that said that the Russian army is neither dumb nor smart. It's slow. But the thing is, once it catches up, then, and that's the situation we find ourselves in at the moment, the Ukrainians, granted, know how to use drones and are coming up with new innovative solutions on an almost daily basis. But the Russians are able to mass produce and outproduce the Ukrainians in a way that, well, Russia's basically the industrial resources allow them to.
Guillaume, thank you. It's Ben Wolfgang. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. But since you're there on the front lines and have a better view into this, obviously, than we do here in the U.S., I'm curious if you could just describe the mood for us, because you know, there's a narrative here in the West that there's, you know, the curse campaign that the Ukrainian military undertook has, you know, obviously given them a shot of momentum, and then perhaps, you know, the tide has turned a little bit from where we were, you know, even 8-9 months or a year ago. Is that an accurate reading of the mood on the front lines based on what you're seeing? Is there a sense of optimism, a sense among especially the soldiers there, Ukrainian soldiers, that the momentum is firmly back on their side at this point, or is that exaggerated based on the reporting that we do here in the West?
No, I would say that's certainly exaggerated in the sense that I think you ought to separate two things basically. There's the war that is being waged on Ukrainian sovereign territory, which is mostly in the east and southeast of the country, and there the Russians have been advancing. As we know, the Ukrainians have been evacuating civilians out of Pokrovsk. It's a city that for a long time was used as a supply hub for cities like Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, and others. Now is threatened by the Russians. They're about 7 kilometers from that town. The city of Vuhledar, which is this kind of impregnable, you know, like little coal mining town on a hill, has fallen to the Russians, even though it had withheld like onslaughts of Russian armored columns for months, years by now. So in the east, the Ukrainians, unfortunately, for them, are retreating bit by bit. But then again, they inflict terrible losses on the Russians. So the strategy over there is, we know we're going to lose ground, but we're going to make them pay a steep price for it. The Kursk gambit, if you will, however, was, and I know that from soldiers who have taken part in that operation, not commanders, like the soldiers who were sent there and went in there, for them, according to those guys, it was a stroke of genius, because their reasoning is as follows. Doesn't matter how the war will end, there is no way in hell that Vladimir Putin will allow, you know, so-called Russian sovereign territory. Well, technically it is according to international law, but so is, you know, Ukrainian's 1991 borders. But that doesn't matter to Putin. He will never allow a chunk of Russia to be left in Ukrainian hands by the end of this war. So it is basically something that can be traded in the event of negotiation. So I wouldn't say optimism, but there's like they're still resolute, they're still stalwart. And most of the soldiers I speak to, they're fairly certain they're going to win the war, but they still know that there's a very difficult fight ahead.
How big of a game changer do you think it would be if the Biden administration decided to allow Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to fire basically wherever they wanted into Russia, deep into Russia, target Russian bases, military depots? Of course, the policy still is limiting that to defensive strikes for the Ukrainians, and there's a big push, obviously, to broaden that policy. Do you get the sense that would make a big difference on the ground, on the front lines of the battlefield?
Well, absolutely. You have to remember that, first of all, the Russian logistic systems is highly dependent on rail. They have been, first, when the HIMARS arrived in Ukraine, they had to start putting the logistics and supply hubs further and further away, just out of range of the HIMARS, which meant, in many cases, bringing them back into Russia instead of having them in Ukraine. Because when all your artillery shell supply for a month go boom, you are on a regular basis, you start understanding, okay, we're going to have to address this problem. But now that they have moved those into Russia, well, it's like Ukraine is being asked to fight an existential war for the very survival of the Ukrainian state. And based on the actions undertaken by the Russians in the territories that they occupy, maybe even of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation, and they're being asked to fight this fight with one hand tied behind their back, because the Russians can strike Ukraine from their own territory and even from the territory of Belarus. But you're going to tell the Ukrainians that no, those guys, that are bombing you and your supermarkets and your delis and your grandmas on a daily basis. Well, no, sir, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to strike the very airfields from which those jets are departing and firing their missiles. It's like, they don't want to shoot down the arrow. They want to shoot down the archer, the bow. And this here is in Russia.
Guillaume, it's been reported by the Kiev Post that some North Korean military officers were killed in Ukraine fighting on the Russian side. Then South Korea's military claimed that it's highly likely that North Korea, with its new strategic partnership with Russia, could deploy troops to Ukraine. How big of a story was that in Kiev? And is that actually something that you think is possible?
I'd say that not only is it possible, I'd say it's plausible, in the sense that Russia has been casting a very, very big net trying to get soldiers. There's this myth that Russia has endless amount, like numbers of people that they can throw into the meat grinder. Okay, well, why are they literally getting Central Asian migrants into Russia under false pretense of work and then conscripting them and sending them straight to the front? They have had Pakistani soldiers found in the Russian army. You've had people from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. You've had people from African countries that were lured into Russia by basically telling them that that you would get a good wage and you would just do like a 6-month stint. The city that I find myself in at the moment, Kharkiv, has been targeted with missiles that have been given or sold rather by North Korea to Russia. So the idea that they would have troops, or at the very least observers or trainers or whatever, it's not that big of a stretch. I honestly think it would be weird at the end of the day if, having supplied that much ammunition and having signed those kind of this kind of partnership and having supported Russia throughout this war, if it didn't have at the very least a couple of observers, if you will, within Ukraine itself. So I think it's something to bear in mind that, while Ukraine's allies titter and think and like there's those political calculations that binds them at all times. Iran is selling its drones. It's sharing technologies with Russia. North Korea is doing it as well. China is as well, but they're restraining themselves to a certain extent because I think they prefer Russians. How to put it, in a little bit of a pickle, because it makes for China, it gives them better negotiating positions on anything. Basically, the Russians have to come and beg to China. So China, it's a bit, I would put it on the side. But yeah, no, it's very plausible.
One more, Guillaume, quickly to wrap up, since we mentioned politics here. I'm just wondering how, from where you sit, how is the U.S. presidential race playing over there? We're just less than a month out from election day here in the U.S. Is there fear of what a Donald Trump administration could mean? Do people think that maybe Kamala Harris would be better for Ukraine? What's the general mood as people, the election 3 weeks away now? What are people saying and thinking about it over there?
So I think obviously generally the Ukrainian population is a bit wary of Donald Trump because of his attitude towards Vladimir Putin. I would call reverential to a certain extent. There's some of the claims that he's made, and choosing as a VP JD Vance, who is, he said himself, I don't care what happens to Ukraine. However, I've also heard it from Ukrainians that, Donald Trump is a man that doesn't want to lose face. And Ukraine losing the war when the USA have already committed so much aid, and at least in principles, and not only in words, but in equipment, in military aid, have committed so much. Would Donald Trump risk losing that war because it would mean losing face for him? And on the other hand, obviously, the Ukrainians would be more inclined maybe to prefer a victory of Kamala Harris, but they're also thinking that the Biden administration's policy towards Ukraine has been at times kind of hard to wrap our minds around. Absolutely, really, yeah, basically really difficult to understand, and putting those kind of roadblocks on the way of Ukrainian defending themselves, that they are thinking, well, if Kamala Harris presidency means a continuation of the policies of the Biden administration, well, we don't know. So I would say that the Ukrainians generally are wary of Donald Trump and are kind of leaning more towards Kamala Harris. But at the end of the day, they're like, it's not exactly like there's a clear side that they would want to pick. They're not interested in US domestic politics in the sense that each people should rule themselves as they choose. But what they want is that the US respects its former commitments, as stated in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when the Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. The US and Russia back then said, we will guarantee the integrity of Ukraine's sovereign territory and its borders. So they just want, basically, the Americans to uphold their word.
Guillaume Ptak, you can read his dispatches and war correspondence on the threat status pages at the Washington Times. Guillaume, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Guillaume.
Thanks, guys. Merci beaucoup.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. And Guy, my threat of the week this week is political gossip. And this came to mind because of the new Bob Woodward book titled War, which is due out next week. Now, two quick disclaimers here. One, I haven't read the book. It's officially out next week, but there are a lot of media outlets that have seen advanced copies. And there are a lot of juicy excerpts floating around out there, which is what I'm going to focus on. But number two, and probably even more importantly, is that any journalist worth his or her salt has a lot of respect for what Bob Woodward has accomplished and the fact that he's done literally some of the most important journalism in American history. And his books are generally great. Plan of Attack, which is sort of the quintessential look at the George W. Bush administration's decision-making around the invasion of Iraq in 2003, is probably a personal favorite of mine. But the excerpts of War that we've seen so far do make me wonder about whether we, the public, are well served by some of this. Now, parts of it are very helpful. Woodward's reporting that Donald Trump has allegedly talked to Vladimir Putin 7 times since he left office is a fascinating bit of information. Now, Trump's camp has denied Woodward's claims. It should be noted, of course, here. But other parts of the book, Guy, kind of struck me a little bit the wrong way, at least based on what I've seen so far, particularly portions about conversations between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's no secret they have a frosty relationship and that the Biden administration has objected loudly and publicly at times to the way Israel has conducted the war against Hamas in Gaza. But the book gives a window into these private discussions between the two men that I think kind of might blow things out of proportion a bit in a way. For example, according to some excerpts, Biden went on a profanity-laden tirade calling Netanyahu an SOB and a bad effing guy, unquote, according to the book. Let's be clear, Biden has issues with Netanyahu. That's no secret. The book also says that Biden feels Netanyahu has been routinely lying to him. Now, that's all good information as a journalist to have. But do I care that he called him an SOB? Do I care that he called him a bad effing guy? I don't care, Guy. I mean, look, you and I argue sometimes about our jobs and about what we're going to talk about here in the podcast. For listeners who might not know, I play in a band in Washington, D.C., and sometimes get into arguments with bandmates about what song we should open our next show with. So none of that obviously is nearly as important and world shaping as the stuff that Biden and Netanyahu talk about regularly. But frankly, I'd be surprised if world leaders, even allies, friends, didn't curse each other out and get into these kinds of arguments on a consistent basis. So right now, my thread of the week is political gossip, not because I think this book is bad. I'm sure it's good. I'm going to read it as I do most of Woodward's books, but it's because I think there's a danger, especially in this social media age, Guy, of getting caught up in these salacious headlines, profanity-laced tirades and the like, shouting matches between Biden and Netanyahu, when in reality, I'm sure that probably happens regularly, and it probably should happen regularly. That's why we say the president of the United States is the most important job in the world. So the substance is what's important here, I think, not necessarily the yelling and the expletives.
And definitely, Ben. I'm just trying to get my head around the idea of Biden storming around some room somewhere at his age, calling someone an SOB and a bad effing guy. I mean, my grandfather used to call bad drivers jackasses, but I think you're onto something with the hype that goes into the behind the scenes accounts in these books and the impact that has on the political flavor of the day. My thread of the week, Ben, is that of China working to undermine U.S.-led security coalitions and multilateral peace initiatives in various hotspots around the world, with the nuance being that the U.S. In recent memory has really struggled to find a way to convince Beijing to participate and work together to halt rather than perpetuate wars in places like Myanmar, Sudan, and the Middle East. One quick example is what I outlined earlier with regard to China turning down U.S. invitations to work together against Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Another example is Sudan's civil war. While U.S. diplomats engage in shuttle diplomacy with Arab partners and European partners to try to get the two sides of that war to engage in a ceasefire, China has clearly backed one side, having invited Sudanese General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan to Beijing recently to ink deals with Xi Jinping for Chinese companies to bring nuclear power, port, and airport projects to Sudan. I want to note for very informed Sudan watchers who may be listening, we're certainly aware in our own coverage of how complex the situation in Sudan is. Perhaps the U.S. and China could be working together to bring an end to the civil war there that has spawned the worst famine the human species has seen in decades. But my thread of the week is that China is working to undermine U.S. leadership to resolve such conflicts.
Yeah, it's a big picture, overarching threat that I think encompasses obviously a lot of different theaters in the world and a lot of different conflicts and a lot of different issues. So it's something we're gonna obviously keep an eye on and talk about a lot more here in the Threat Status Podcast. Big thanks to Guillaume Ptak coming to us from the front lines in Ukraine, and thank you all for listening. As always, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.